Welcome to episode 9 of Coral's Soapbox. Good morning, Coral.
Good
Episode 9.
morning, Matt,
Wow.
and good morning, everyone. I do apologise in advance. I've got a bit of a cold and a sore throat, but when has that ever stopped me talking in the past? So hopefully we'll be right.
Nothing's going to
So
stop
today
you.
we're doing men. Oh, that came out wrong, didn't it?
Just as I said, nothing's going to stop you.
Yeah. Today we're exploring male characters. Does that sound better?
That sounds good. Now, before we do, I want to throw one question at you about this that you are
Uh-oh,
not prepared
okay.
for. I love doing this. All these years later, now Prisoner, I think what 45 years later with Prisoner, was there ever a male character that you did create that didn't make it to the show, or was there a character that, looking back now, you would have loved to have created for the show? Like all these years later, thinking, geez, that would have worked so good for that show if I created that character.
Well, well, I have to say that I did create a character that did make it to being shot, that did go to air here in Australia, but then was cut completely from the show because the story was too contentious. And that was, and 45 years later, it's back in the news again. That was the transgender character. And I can't remember his name or her name, but that was a story in which the character had had a sex change operation and had originally been put into a male prison because in those days he'd been put into Woodridge, and in those days you could not change your gender. Even if you had a sex change operation, you couldn't change your gender on your birth certificate. And when that story hit air, they actually asked questions in Parliament about that very thing. And a couple of years later, the law was changed so that you could change your gender if you had what we now call gender reassignment, but in those days was called a sex change. But I also want to confess to something else. Do you have a any questions there on Rick Manning?
Not actually, no, there's not one on Rick Manning.
Okay, well, I think there was one on the page. It probably didn't make it to your shortlist. But I have to confess here that the actor who played Andy Anderson was so obnoxious and rude to the entire creative department that I deliberately wrote him out. I didn't have to. He wanted to stay on. The powers that be didn't really care one way or the other. And I actually thought, bugger you, how dare you come in here and tell us what to do? He fancied himself as a writer. And so he would come in and keep telling us, oh, you should have done it this way, or you should have done it that way, or why haven't I got a big story this week, or whatever. So I actually nipped his career in the bud. I cut him off
Oh,
after, I think, only about 16 weeks to air. And he was supposed to be a long-term replacement for Fletch.
really?
And he was a good looking guy. And he just was so obnoxious as a person. He was a Kiwi actor. He was so obnoxious as a person. It's the one and only time I have knocked a perfectly good character on the head and got rid of it simply because I couldn't stand the actor. I've never ever done that in any show before. If the actor hasn't worked, I've written them out, or if the powers that be said we can't afford them, I've written them out. Um, but I have never ever written out a character because the actor was so obnoxious. But I did in the case of Rick Manning. So there's a little bit of scandal
For the
for all
fans,
the
I never
prisoner
knew that.
fans out
I
there.
actually enjoyed his character. I mean, obviously, personally, I didn't know him, but
I enjoyed the character too, but I could not deal with the actor himself. He was a rude prick, if you will excuse the expression. He he would come in, and he had only just been in the show for a spit and a cough. He hadn't earned his stripes, if you like. He would come in and he would say, I don't know what you guys do in here all day long, but this story is crap and I don't want to do it, and why aren't I getting more lines? And he was so rude. I thought, well, this is a hard enough job to do without someone who is coming in. I just got angry, but the other storyliners with whom I shared an office at that stage, they would get so down because they were doing their best to make the stories work. I mean, I came up with the stories, but very often it was the storyliners that actually said, oh, I've got a twist I could put in here. And I would say, go for it. If it makes the story better, go for it. And this obnoxious man would come in and literally tell us we were all crap. And so I wrote him out before even he was due to go. And they were thinking of renewing his contract. He could have been a long-term
Wow.
character lasting for years and years in the show. And instead, he got a very short run because he was so obnoxious. So never underestimate the power of a script producer or story editor, because they're the ones you need to cultivate if you're an actor, because they're the ones that can write you out.
Did that happen often on the show? Like the cast would come to you and say, this storyline's not
Very,
the
very occasionally. When we did the breast cancer story for Anne,
Yep.
it was originally planned as a story for Meg,
Yep.
and the powers that be contacted me and said, Meg won't do it. And I said, what do you mean she won't do it? Elspeth Ballantyne won't do it. And they said, oh, she, for personal reasons. To her great credit, the lovely Ellie, and not everybody loved Elspeth, but I did. And to her great credit, she came, and it's a long way. I don't know if people realise, but the script office, and in fact, entire admin office was not out at Nunawading.
Which
We were in Paran,
top brand?
which you wouldn't know is a fair distance from the studio. And so the cast had no reason to come all that way. And so when people say to me, oh, you must have known them really well, I try to explain we were pretty much an hour's drive away from each other. But Elspeth did come in on a day when she wasn't recording, and she asked to see me, and we sat down and we talked, and she explained, and most of the ladies watching this will know this, she had had a scare of breast cancer.
Yeah.
Fortunately, she didn't have it, but the tests saw her having to go into hospital for a biopsy, and she just freaked when she saw the story because it was so close to what had happened. And then when she realized that the story meant an actual operation, a mastectomy, removal of the breasts, she just said, I can't do it. I'm too freaked out by it. And actually, then I said, well, let's give it to Anne. We haven't got a good story for Anne, so let's give it to Anne. And I think it was better. I think it was better that it was Gerda than to have it be, one of the screws. To have the governor put in that kind of jeopardy, I think was a better story. So Elspeth refusing to do it, it became a story for Anne and not a story for Meg. But very rarely did they come in. Sometimes they would come in. I remember once on Home and Away, um, one of the actors came in, and it was an actor who was Sally was having a romance with, or was married to, or whatever. I can't remember. And he was supposed to be a young doctor, and not the show, the Young Doctors. But
Actual doctor.
yeah, but he came in and he said, I've got a great story for my character. And I said, what's the story? And he said, he becomes a surfer. And I said, okay, but what's the story? Well, he becomes a surfer
That's
and he
it.
goes out surfing. And I said, but that's not a story.
That happens in
What
Summer
happens
Bay
to,
every day.
yeah, well, yeah. What happens to, yeah, but bear in mind, 20 odd years ago, there were not that many. We didn't see surfers very often. We did from that point on. But he said, well, it could become, it could enter a world contest or something. And I said, but you're a doctor. Your character is a doctor. Yeah, but that doesn't mean he couldn't have a hobby. Anyway, there was no story there. Do you think I could persuade this actor that there was no story there? And occasionally actors would come and they would say, I've got a great story, but it wasn't a story at all. One of the people who was a delight who did come up with stories was Josh Lawson. And I can't remember what character he played, but he would come in and he had stories. And of course, he went on to write and direct movies, etc. So he would have done really well had he been in the story department. And on Prisoner, one of the people in the production department actually came to me with 2 or 3 ideas, not full stories, but ideas, which I did in fact use and develop into stories. And he said he was hating being in the production department because he'd come from theatre and he had no idea how to do the scheduling or anything else. And I said to him, well, you actually belong here in the story department. That's where you belong. And he said, when there is a vacancy, would you consider me? And I did. And he became a storyliner. And then he became a prolific soap writer who some of the viewers or some of the people who watch this and don't just watch Prisoner will remember his name from a whole slew of soaps, and that is Kit Oldfield.
Oh,
And Kit Oldfield, do you
he was,
remember Kit Oldfield's name?
I see it all
Well,
the time.
Kit was a lovely, lovely bloke who had come from Newcastle, which is where I went to school and where my dad had his television show in England. He had watched my uncle Jack Haig play Wacky Jackie on television when he was a kid. And he was a very prolific story generator. So he went on to become and have a really good career as a writer. He ran shows for Grundy's in Europe. And he could have been stuck in the production department. So I never ever said no to anyone, but the worst people for generating story, coming up with stories, were the actors themselves, because they always wanted something that featured them, that wasn't practical to do, or that actually had no ongoing worth. We talk about story generation and we talk about stories that are like onions. You know how with an onion you can peel a layer off and then there's another layer and then there's another layer. And that's what we wanted in stories. So what we didn't want was stories that imploded onto themselves where you got like 6 episodes out of it and then that was gone. We wanted stories which were like onion skins, and one skin led to another character or led to another story. And the actresses were never any good at doing that, to be perfectly honest.
That actually
And
brings
there
me
are
to a
some,
question about when you're saying about the storyline and ideas. I'm not sure if this happened on Prisoner in your days, but I watched some behind the scenes of Everyone Loves Raymond the other night in the production,
yeah,
and they were talking about the writers' room. They Most of that show was generated from the ideas of the actual stories that happened to the writers in real life. So they were taking their
that's interesting.
real life situations and putting them in the show. So
Well, this is interesting because some of the die-hard fans will know this. But when I first started writing for Prisoner, and I did, I think, 2 scripts, and then they said, would you come in-house? And I said no the first time, and then the second time I said, well, I will if you give me the department. But when I first went in there, and I'd only written about 2 television scripts in my life, One of the storyliners that they had been an ex-con. I cannot remember his name. I
Oh,
think it was Peter something. And the next time I went in, he wasn't there because he'd been arrested for armed robbery and he was back in the nick. So, so that was one stage. In the very early stages, they did, in fact, try to include real stories. But as with real life, I think it's William Goldman's book, which talks about two stories, one of which is I think it was Rambo he used as an example, and the other story, well, oh no, it was A Bridge Too Far, and the other story it was the story of a man breaking into the Queen's bedroom and sitting on the end of the bed, and the Queen woke up and screamed and security came, etc., etc. And it was like he was asking which one is the true story. And the true story, although it seems like the fictional one, was the story of the man breaking into the Queen's bedroom. A Bridge Too Far, although it was a real happening, it was a real battle, if you like, in the Second World War. They took incredible liberties with it on screen. But you'd rather believe that than believe that someone could actually break into the Queen's bedroom. Similarly, he talks about violence in films. Which is the most violent film, Rambo or Bambi?
well, I would say Rambo.
No,
Real? Why?
Bambi is the most violent film. The deers get shot, Bambi's mother gets killed. It presents as real life, but real life in the
Ah,
lives of animals. Whereas Rambo, you know it's cartoon stuff right from the beginning. You know when he's firing that gun, it's not real, it's a movie. So although you would automatically say Rambo,
yeah, but it's not.
it's
I
not.
get that
It's
completely.
Bambi because Bambi, the violence is the violence of your mother being shot and killed in front of you. Even though it's a cartoon, it's more real than a film like Rambo, which virtually plays like a cartoon. And it's really interesting when you look at films in that way. And I think it's partly what's led to, and this is a big ongoing debate, it's partly what's led to the slew of violence that we see happening in America in particular, is that they've been spoon-fed violence, which isn't real. And now there's a whole generation of people who can't tell the difference between what is real and
Yeah,
what is fantasy. And
yeah,
so they go out and they stick bum stock things on semi-automatic rifles and they fire off 50 rounds a second, but it's not real to them.
yeah,
They fire it into a crowd, they kill 50 odd people, but it's not real to them.
yeah,
One on one, a deer devastated by its mother's death is far more real. And incidentally, since we always have or I always do anyway, recommendations of things to watch. Sweet Tooth is a series on Netflix. Have you watched it, Matt?
Jerry Seinfeld. We start. Excuse me. We started watching the first episode, but I'm not sure
Of,
about it.
of Sweet Tooth?
Yeah, is it the one Jerry Seinfeld is in?
No, 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 no,
Oh,
no, 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 no,
hang
no.
on.
Sweet Tooth is it's a dystopian fairy tale. It's set
Oh, sorry, I'm thinking
sometime
of
in
the
the
one.
future where a pandemic has happened at the same and wiped out most humans,
Ah,
and
okay.
what is left is a generation of hybrids that are part animal and part human. And Sweet Tooth himself is a 10-year-old boy who is part deer.
Oh, wow. No, I haven't heard that one.
So he's got deer ears and deer antlers. Other than that, he is a normal looking boy. And people who are giving birth to babies are giving birth to babies with pig noses. There's been genetic engineering going on in the labs that has got out of control. I'm binging on it because it's kind of like there is a quest in it, and it's kind of like Lord of the Rings meets, oh gosh, I don't know. Oh, it's a futuristic Lord of the Rings, if you like, but it's well worth seeing. And the
It
kids,
sounds like all the conspiracy theorist people during the pandemic that were talking about baby
it
things.
is. But the wonderful thing about it is that although it's quite violent and it's made for adult, I would call it a fairy tale for adults in that you have this group of hybrid children who all look like different animals, but they can all talk and they all have human qualities, and they're not entirely animal. Like one has a pig nose, another one has a trunk like an elephant, another one has a tail and can swing like a monkey, and then there's this little animatron, which is like a little gopher, who's called Bobby, and he walks around and says, "Bobby don't like this. Bobby tried to escape," and it's really a fairy tale for grown-ups. But not too far removed from the truth of what we're doing, and the brains behind it, the executive producers and partial creators of it, are Robert Downey Jr. and his wife.
Oh,
So
really? Oh, wow.
Sweet Tooth is well worth watching. I'm absolutely hooked. I've
What's
started
it?
on series 2.
Actually, just on that note, I want to ask you, being such a legendary writer of soaps and shows and character development, everything you did in your career, do you ever sit and watch a show and think, what I would have taken in that character and done that? Is your head always?
It always is, and I always think, well, there's a missed story opportunity. But there are very few shows which I sit and watch and say, oh my God, I would have killed to write that. And The West Wing is one. I
Yeah.
would have killed to have been a writer on The West Wing and worked with Aaron Sorkin. I don't know who I would have killed, but please, folks, it wouldn't have been Val Lehman, so don't put messages up about that. The other thing I want to recommend is especially for all our British um, fans, is a little film called The Duke. Now, it was made in 1920, no, 1922. God almighty, that's the year my parents were born. It was made in 2022. It stars Jim Broadbent and Helen Mirren. And Helen Mirren, believe it or not, plays a frumpy 60-year-old housewife. Never seen her look like that before, probably never will again. It's an absolute delight. It's about a real robbery of a portrait of the Duke of Wellington, and it's funny, it's beautifully written, it's wonderfully acted. That has also dropped this week on Netflix here. So put The
Check
Duke
it out.
and Sweet Tooth
Me too.
on
Okay.
your list of things to
Watching
see,
tonight.
because they're both delightful. They're absolutely delightful. Now let's get on to the
The
main
men.
subject,
The men.
the
Yeah,
men.
we've been going half an hour already.
Oh my God, where do you want to start, Matt?
Well, I will put, okay, so we've got some questions here, and there are some about characters that were before your time, but
Yeah.
the fans love hearing your thoughts on things as well.
Okay.
Max Dweeb said, like so many, I absolutely love to hear about all the behind the scenes info. Coral, you are bloody brilliant giving us your time. Uh,
Just an old lady with a good memory.
it's not, um, he was talking about the character of Phillip Cleary and put
Oh my
why
God. Oh,
with
yeah.
question marks.
Why?
He should have been stabbed by
Matt
Bev.
is, I have said this many, many times about Phil Cleary. Why? Um, that was a classic case of the casting being so wrong that the character was, excuse my French, fucked before he ever even hit air. Just absolute disaster. I thought it would be good to have a male character who was sympathetic towards the women, who actually helped the women and build towards. And I didn't have a particular prisoner in mind. It might have been Bobby or someone like that, because I think they were at roughly the same time, but who actually falls in love with one of the prisoners and helps her escape so
Ah,
that they can be together. This was the long-term story. Totally sympathetic guy who sees potential in one of the women, thinks she could have been something if she'd had the right chances, and helps her to get out. They have a romance and he helps her to get out. And then when he is arrested, she comes forward and says he had nothing to do with it. Why would I be bothered with him? So that story, the second we saw who they'd cast, before they even started shooting with him, the second I saw his audition scene, I said, well, there goes that story in the
oh,
rubbish bin.
really? So you couldn't at that time go, hang on, this is not going to work with that. I mean, and no
No,
disrespect to it because he
I
has
could
passed away,
not.
but
I did, for example, with the kids shows that I did in Perth. I did with Blue Healers. I did with Home and Away. I got to see, and I did, of course, with Arcade, because I created all those characters in Arcade. And, you know, there was the main character ended up being played by Danielle Spencer, um, Russell Crowe's wife, or had that
that's
they
why.
weren't even married at the time, I don't think. But I had wanted Libby Tanner, who Australian TV fans will know from a huge variety of shows, who is a fantastic actress. And I was told she can play the lesbian, but no one will believe her as, you know, the leading lady, just because she's not sexy. She's too plain. Well, I don't think there's anything plain about Libby Tanner, but even if there were, she was a far superior actress and should have had the role and didn't get the role because
She
she
become
wasn't
big
pretty
on
enough.
she become big on McLeod's Daughters. Is that right?
She became big on any number of shows. She did an ABC series about firemen, or I can't remember what it was called, but she's done, I'm sorry for that little pinging sound, but I can't turn the sound off, because if I do, you won't be able to hear me.
That's okay.
So we have to put up with pings. So the problem with Phil Cleary was the casting. Once I saw who had been cast, there was no way it was going to work ever. If I could have had someone like, he wouldn't have been old enough, he'd still have been at school, but if I'd had someone like Eric Banner to play Phil Cleary, the character would have worked and we would have believed the story. But absolute disaster. Have to take part of the blame in that I was trying to write a more altruistic character.
Yeah.
And so altruistic to them, the powers that be, meant goody goody. And they cast this, God love him, I can't remember the actor's name. And I
No,
do.
it was Rob Summerton, I think, and he passed away last year or the year before.
Oh, did
Um,
he? Oh, well, all I can say is he was actually a lovely bloke,
yeah, yeah.
but he was on screen a total wimp. The women would have run roughshod over him. He wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes.
But
And
every
that's
time
what
you
people
talk about
saw.
these things, I get these. Sorry, I always get a question comes into my head, and I hate
Yeah.
interrupting you. But do you think? Because you just said about that character, that cast member, it didn't work. So do you think if the writers' room and everything was at Nutter Whiting, like TV shows are these days, where the writers are actually on set, you would have been there going, no, this is not work. We need to
I
recast.
wouldn't have, I would not have, it would have been a totally different ball game.
Yeah.
Let me explain to people who don't know that in those days, there was no writer's room per se. There was a story room, and I was a story editor, and the title then became story producer, then became script producer. Okay, but it's the same job. Create the stories, do the breakdowns, brief the writers. And then in those days, my input stopped. I never saw the script after it was edited. So huge changes could have been made. And in those days, the director was God. Now, the director is a gun for hire, and the showrunner, who is the progression of the job I did, the showrunner can fire a director. The
Yeah.
showrunner can go to casting and say, whoa, 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 not on. However, the showrunner sees every audition of every actor and helps choose those people. Now, I know I talk a lot about my daughter, but it's only because she's currently doing a show, and so it's useful for the contrast. Kelly sees all the casting before she writes the scripts. She knows the person they're dealing with, and what she's able to do is include, if they're set on going with that person, include idiosyncrasies that go with that person. In Under the Vines, the character of Daisy, played by Rebecca Gibney, well, Kelly met and knew Rebecca Gibney long before she started creating stories for her. She knew what she would be comfortable with. She knew what were her strengths and how she could play to them. The other character, the English male character, is played by Charles Edwards, terrific English actor who was in Downton Abbey and is, funnily enough, in this film, The Duke, that I just mentioned.
Ah,
She had wanted, and I don't know if you know of him, but she had wanted Stephen Mangan to play that part. Very offbeat actor. He now co-hosts Portrait Artist of the Year and things like that. But he was a comedy actor, and so you might have seen him on Would I Lie to You and things
okay.
like that.
Yep.
And he was in the English film, which was about hospitals, the English series, which was a comedy series about hospitals. Can't remember what it was called. But she had wanted Stephen Mangan, and when they couldn't get Stephen Mangan, then Charles Edwards was offered. And before they even took Charles Edwards, Kelly talked to him extensively, so she knew what he was about. When I was doing Arcade, for example, and this is someone who now is not acting anymore, but was a very fine actor and who had a training in New York and might be interesting down the track for us to talk to, Matt, is Lloyd Morris, who played Trey Devlin in Arcade.
Oh,
Now, I created Arcade and did the first 100 episodes of it before I quit. In later episodes, I discovered that Lloyd, who played Trey, was a very fine jazz pianist, and I never knew it. And there was a story in which he goes crazy and becomes a serial killer. And if I had known that he was a great pianist, I would have written in
yes.
that he leaves a trademark by this little piece of music, for example. And it's like, who wrote this music? Where did it come from? I would have used that. I would have utilized those things. But in the days when we were doing Prisoner, we were an hour's drive separation. We had no say in what happened after the script was written. Um, and we rarely got to the studio. Rarely got to the studio. Now there is a writer's room, and all the writers meet in that room, and they slog the story out, even if they are not writing the script.
Yeah.
They all, the whole of the team of writers on the show, Kelly's just had 3 days with, I think it's 8 writers,
Wow.
and all 8 have some input into the 8 episodes, or however many episodes it is they're doing. And then one writer goes away and writes it. So it's a totally different system now. Is it a better system? Well, it's got to be better for the writers.
Yeah.
Is it better for the show? I guess so if you've got a good person overall as the showrunner. Um,
And I guess
but
the good thing
there
now
are
is
some
they can see feedback now. Like, I mean, obviously, like I don't think Netflix is jumping on Facebook to check comments, but you can get a general, oh, this show is not working, or that character, there's
absolutely,
backlash.
but bear in
Back
mind,
then, you wouldn't.
bear in mind that Kelly at the moment has just finished setting up the episodes for series 4 of Under the Vines, right? When do you think, not when is it going to be seen on air, but when do you think it's going to be shot? Have a guess when it's going to be shot. She's finished the stories and they're all doing their scripts, including she is doing the first one. When do you think it's going to be shot?
Well, they start shooting now, wouldn't they? They've written the first script.
Uh-uh.
No,
No, have a guess. Just guess a date.
few like 2 months, 3 months.
It's going to be shot between September and December 2025.
Oh wow! And they're writing it now.
And they're writing it now.
Wow. So what? Why is that such a long?
Because Acorn is commissioning its 2026
Wow.
stuff now. Now, the things you face, and they have faced on that show, is because it's virtually 12 months or more. It's been about 8 or 9 months on the first 3 series, but this one they had already locked in their 25 um, schedule. And so they said, you know what, we think there is another series in this, plus maybe a Christmas special. And but they couldn't slot it in to 2025 because that was already set. So they're going to shoot in 2025 and it goes to air in 2026. Now, because of the long delays between things being written and being shot, and this happens regularly, and it has happened on that particular show, you can lose a cast member.
I was about to ask that. What happens
And
if they?
then you have to go back and start all over again with the script because it's been recast, and that new person may not. You can't change the whole line of stories if the person who you have lost, in this case somebody becoming seriously ill and having to give up work, you can't suddenly say, well, we'll write them out, because that would be a case of changing every single story in every episode. So you recast, and the person you recast may not have the same foibles or the same idiosyncrasies
Wow.
that the actor you've been used to seeing in that role would have. And so you suddenly think, why is this character not working when it's worked for, it's worked for 2 seasons, now it's not working? Well, it's the casting. Unfortunately, it's the casting. You can have the greatest character in the world, and this is where I guess actors do feel proprietorial over the characters they play and say, well, it's me. Because if you did cast someone else, you would get a different version. Now, if you'd never seen the original, you might like the new version even better.
Yeah.
But if you have seen the original, like people who commented that they still could not see anyone else playing B. Smith but Val Lehman, but that's because they've seen Val play B. Smith.
Yeah.
If they'd seen Maggie play B. Smith to start with, or if they had seen Maggie Miller play B. Smith to start with, or Carol Skinner play B. Smith to start with, and then Val took over, they would say, oh, she's not as good as the original, is she? So the original is always the one which sticks in
Funny.
people's
It's
minds.
funny that though, because there was I know I don't think you've seen Sons of Anarchy yet, but when they shot the pilot, the head of the bikie club was
And they replaced him. Yeah,
Clay Morrow, and
yeah,
that character. So they shot the pilot with this original actor. I'm trying to think of his name. An accomplished actor. He's done over 120 movies.
yeah,
But Kurt Sutter went, no, it's not working. So they reshot the pilot. They apparently they
yeah,
spent 500 grand and got
yeah.
Ron Perlman, who we all know.
I have heard this story. Yep.
Yeah.
If you cast wrong, then particularly in a pilot, because the pilot, and I mean, we don't shoot pilots. We have never had the luxury of being able to shoot a pilot and then them say, oh, yeah, we like it, but try it with someone else in
What do
this
they
role
call it
or
over
this
there? Pilot week or pilot month or something, where all these pilots.
Yeah, absolutely. What they do is, and they did try to do it here on Channel 10 a couple of years ago, they shoot a lot of pilots and then all those pilots are submitted to the networks. And the network says, oh, we want that, or we want that, or we want this. And some of them go on to be huge successes. Some of them have slow starts. I mean, off the back of the Batman franchise in movies came a series which I don't know if you've seen, Matt. I suspect we're going to end up doing Men in Prisoner
Oh,
as
actually
box
we've got to
10,
get.
the way
Okay,
we're going. Off the back came a series called Pennyworth. Have you seen
I've
any of
heard of it.
Pennyworth?
Haven't seen it yet.
Pennyworth is fantastic. Again, it's futuristic, dystopian. It's set in the future, and it's about Batman, Bruce Wayne's butler
Oh,
when he
Alfred.
was young.
Oh, love it.
So it's not Michael Caine, it's an English actor who just has enough of Michael Caine to make you believe it. And it's absolutely the first two or three series, it then goes off the rails, as most of them do. But the first two or three series are absolutely fantastic. And that is available. If you haven't seen Pennyworth, you've got to watch it
Check it
because you
out.
go, oh my God.
Nothing beats the original Batman from the 60s. That was my favorite.
Oh, absolutely. So you've got to see this. I think it was made around 2021, somewhere
Check it
like
out.
that. And it's the same English creator and writer of the whole of the first series. And it's just brilliant stuff because they're all dead gall blimey and they talk a bit like, oh, I'm Michael Caine. And it's hysterical because they never they refer to Michael Caine like, for example, they'll drive down a street and you'll see a street sign which says Caine Street,
Main Street.
or it'll have some reference that's like an in joke. So it's absolutely delightful if you love the Batman movies.
Check
It's
it out.
delightful to watch anyway to see how many references you can see. But yes, that was a show in which they shot a pilot because everybody said, I just can't see it. I don't get it. What is it? What's it all about? But
Yeah.
it's about an alternative London in the 1960s.
Wow.
So it's 60s, it's mini skirts, it's strip clubs, it's all of that. But there's also a dystopian war going on,
Big shrugs and rock and roll.
with a mad general trying to take over the UK, and it's just brilliant. It's
Amazing.
absolutely brilliant storytelling and compulsive viewing. So there's another one for you, Matt.
I'll check it
This is
out.
going to be a 2 hour episode, I
I'll get
can
into
see.
now. I know you saw this. I know you saw this question on the Talking Prisoner Facebook page, but I'll read it out. It would really be interesting to hear Coral's perspective on two of the male characters she created, Stan Dobson and Dennis Cruickshank. Did the actors' performances live up to the expectations, and did the characters develop as intended? Now, there's also just one more part to this question.
Yeah.
Incidentally, there's something else that I've been pondering. When Eddie Parslow enters the series and it acknowledged
Yeah.
she knew Meg's mother, Bertha Coppin, would I be right in thinking that the name was inspired by those of Coral's grandparents? Throughout years of numerous prisoner forums, message boards, and everything, no one else appears to have made the link. Thank you, Matt and Coral. Really enjoy these. Two things there.
Okay, well, let me deal with the second one first. In show business, it's not unusual to have many names, right? I was born Coral O'Neill. I took as a stage name in my pop singing days and acting days the surname of Kelly. So I was Coral Kelly. And a lot of people only know me as Coral Kelly. Then, when I started living with a long term partner for 20 years, I took his name, Coral Drouyn. I took Drouyn as my name. And even though, as you know, I just lost my husband, even though his surname was Gregory, because everybody knew me as Coral Drouyn, I did not take his surname. So I'm not sure what my grandparents' given names were. I know that my grandfather was born Charles Denman,
Right.
but somewhere along the way he became Charles Coppin. And whether it was a stage name or whether he changed his name, I don't know. He became Charles Coppin. My grandmother already had a film career, and her name in her film career was Bertha Baker.
Right.
Now, when she married my grandfather, she became, even though she was never known as anything other than Bertha Baker, she became literally Mrs. Coppin. She became Bertha Coppin. Now, both of her children had the surname Haig. I have no way of knowing how they got the surname Haig, but my uncle Jack Haig was a very well-known character
Could be
actor in
related to
English
the
television.
Hague chocolate dynasty in Melbourne.
Yes. No. Um, Jack Haig was a very well-known actor in England. Um, People still see him in Hello, Hello, is as it is I, Monsieur Leclerc, and many, many other shows. Are You Being Served? Some others do have him. He was always popping up on television, and he was also a variety, what we called a variety artist, which is vaudeville, and he was also a West End actor, winning an Evening Standard Award for Canterbury Tales some 40 or 50 years ago. So, and my mother was Peggy Haig, but
Yeah.
I decided to use Bertha Coppin, which was my grandmother's married name. So there are like, and then I've got O'Neill and Drouyn in my working life. So there are any number of names. Now, to get to the first part of the question,
But hang on, isn't it
Brian,
amazing what? And I'm a fan myself, and I sometimes don't remember, but like what some fans remember of this
I'm
show.
just astonished. I am just,
I love it.
what amazes me is that when, wasn't it Joan McRobbie who asked that
Yes,
question?
John McRobbie. Yes,
Well, how well do I remember at my
there you
age?
go.
Because I read it on the board a week or two ago, and I remembered it, and was just so. I haven't asked him yet. How come he knew what my grandmother's name was? Because I don't think I've ever said on any forum, oh, I picked that name. Etty Parslow uses it in that. Incidentally, the name Etty Parslow, which is a brilliant name, was suggested by one. I created the character, but the name for the character, which I think is a brilliant name, was suggested by one of my storyliners. So
Ah,
it's not like I did all of this completely alone. I had people to bounce off all the time. And Etty was a wonderful character. We should talk about her sometime
yeah, I
too,
love it.
because I loved that character. But um, in the
But
case of Stan the Man
yes,
and Dennis,
Dennis.
um, yes, they did fulfill what I saw for the characters as actors, but whether or not their potential was fulfilled completely by the scripts or by the direction is another story entirely. I mean, I wrote a scene, um, and to be honest, I stole it from Taxi Driver in a way, but I wrote a scene for Dennis when he's trying to chat up Meg. Remember those early scenes where he likes Meg and he sort of wants
He
to
liked
ask her
everyone in Prisoner. He
Sorry?
liked everyone. He was with Victoria Nichols.
Yeah, he was an Englishman. It was like, oh, there's all these Australian girls, and oh, wow. But I wrote a scene for him in which he rehearsed everything to a mirror. So he was talking to himself. And the powers, now we see that now so often in films and television that it's almost a cliche. But you didn't see it 45 years ago. And the powers that be said to me, you can't have him talking to himself. And I said, why not? And they said, well, people will think he's crazy unless you're going to have him go crazy and be a loony. People will think he's crazy. Well, there was a rule: you can't have a one-sided telephone conversation because actors can't convey what's happening in the silences while they're listening, both of which we did
Yeah.
multiple times. Every time we did it, which is now just it's a trope. It happens so often. It's something you do. Just, oh yeah, we go to one-sided phone call. Oh, you let him talk to himself in the mirror. That way we get information. You know, it's great. Instead of somebody clunkily coming along and saying, oh, did you hear about so and so? Apparently such and such happened. If you have someone talking into a mirror saying, look, it's something I got to tell you, but I don't know, I don't know how to start. No, no, that's not right. I want to tell you something and I don't want you to react until I've finished. No, no, that's not right. Um, that's more real. That's more what a person would do than having somebody write a piece of what we call exposition. And Dennis's character played that really, that type of slightly goofy, but well, I won't say sex crazy, but certainly slightly interested in the ladies character, this fresh-faced, almost English rose type Englishman. And I thought Nigel Bradshaw was perfectly physically cast to play that because he couldn't be anything but English.
Right.
And he also happened to be a bloody good actor. But when I saw some of his finished work, I thought, well, that's not where the story went, or that's not what the mood was for that scene, supposed to be for that scene. So I think in some ways, Dennis fell victim to the Suits syndrome. If I'd had my way, that character would have been more of a, I don't know if any of you out here remember him, but he would have been more of a Tommy Steele type character. He would have been more a bit of a larrikin, a bit of a lad. He would have brought an English vibe to everything in that. He would have
Going to
always
the
wanted
pub
a
after
beer, and
work,
the
having
beer's not cold enough, and you know, oh, the beer's too cold. You know, but what are you doing? I'm warming up the beer. You know, he would have been more that type
He
of a
spoke very
character.
highly of you. I had lunch with him a while ago in St Kilda. He was over from the UK for a few weeks, and he remembers you. He spoke very highly of
Oh,
you.
that's very sweet of him. That's sweet of him because I think we only met once, maybe twice. But I tried to give him good stories. They didn't always end up as well as they should have. In
But
the
did you
case of
wrote him a
Stan,
horrific exit?
I can't remember. I think he had an offer from England and he wanted to go back. And so it had to be something which was um, a big thing. And the thing is, people say, oh, you know, he should have lived happily ever after with Meg.
Meg
Well, how could he? He wanted
couldn't.
to leave the show, number one. Number two, how much could we accommodate an actor in a wheelchair who could only be seen at home? So I hasten to add that Nigel Bradshaw was at no time paraplegic and in a wheelchair. However, it did give us a chance to do a story for him in which, even though Meg is prepared, and I hope to God that I've got the story right, because this is the way we wrote it, and I hope this is the way it ended up, he virtually sacrifices the relationship with Meg. Meg, being stoic, wonderful Meg that she is, would have stayed with him. They would have worked it through. He wasn't going to see her ruin her life looking after a man in a wheelchair. And so, despite loving her, he said, it's not going to work. I don't want this. and he was out of there. Now, am I remembering it right, Matt?
Yeah, no, that's right, and that's what I
That's
love
right.
about Prisoner, because the exits that, I mean, you and a lot of other writers gave these characters were amazing. You compare it to Neighbours in the early days. Every character that left Neighbours went to moving to Queensland. I think there's a whole nother TV show of Neighbours
Yeah,
happening.
yeah, of ex-neighbours. The thing for me was, if it's a good character, you give them a noble exit. If it's a bad character, you give them their just desserts. That's why when I couldn't get the just desserts exit for Ruth Ballinger, I went for the noble exit with Myra.
Yeah.
So for me, it's important that you consider those things because audiences have invested
Fine.
emotionally in those characters.
Yeah.
And for him to just have gone off to a nursing home, or for him to have stayed with Meg and ultimately seen what they were building, because they were building towards a genuine relationship, and to have that go sour by having him in a wheelchair all the time, what could we do with him story wise? We couldn't. So when we knew he wanted to leave, and again, I'm pretty certain that it was because Nigel had
Yeah, there was.
an
I remember
offer.
him saying, yeah.
It was. Oh, right. Okay. So when you talked to him, he got an offer from England, and he actually had still had some time left on his contract, but he got this offer, and I think it was one of the times I talked to him, and the suit said to me, "Do you need this character?" And I, because he's got this offer, and I think one of the times he actually came and talked to me was to tell me, "I've got this offer, but I'm still under contract." And so I said to the suits, "No, we could lose the character. It's not a huge problem." Because otherwise he would have missed out on what was a very, very good opportunity for him. But in doing that, we didn't just want to say, well, he's gone off to a prison in Queensland. We wanted to give him a noble exit. We wanted to give him, he virtually ditches Meg in order to save her, despite the fact that he really loves her.
Yeah.
Um, and that was the right exit for that character.
Definitely.
Stan Dobson was played by one of the most revered actors at the time, Brian James, I think, I hope. And Brian James was one of those people who, he was a very fine actor, but you'd never cast him as a baddie. You wouldn't, he was such an inherently decent person that you knew if you brought him in, it could not be long term because you have your goodies and they're earmarked, and this show is about the prisoners.
Yep.
What is of the most peril to the prisoners? Bad screws, not a good screw, not a lovely person who will do everything for them. So we knew that it would be a limited time, and because of that, I can't remember. Did Stan retire?
No, that I've got a question about this character. I loved Stan. I thought he was amazing. But what didn't sit right with me with his character is, I think he had a heart attack on the like, as an officer.
Ah, right, yeah,
Then they didn't want to lose him, so they brought him back he became the prison
the
handyman. And then
prison
I'm like,
handyman, yeah,
that didn't work for me. But I thought character that as the officer was great. But yeah, coming back
yeah,
as the handyman, I'm like, yeah,
yeah. What episode do you remember roughly? What episode he came back as a handyman? That was when he formed the strong relationship
Bobby, Maxine,
with
yeah,
Bobby. Was when he
yeah,
was a handyman, wasn't it?
correct.
Okay. This this I now remember. Sometimes my memory needs a jog, right? We knew that as a good screw, we would have to have him just for a short term. But he was so delightful. I mean, he was a delightful man. He's gone now, God bless him. But he was a delightful man as well as a delightful actor. He was so delightful that and I'm to blame for this, I take total blame for this. After Brian had left and we'd done the heart attack story and he'd had to retire, We needed a chance to give Bobby a family because
Ah,
I wanted to redeem Bobby, because otherwise you could see her just being a recidivist and going backwards and forwards all the time. So to prison all the time, I mean.
yeah.
So we needed to introduce someone who could become her family. And in the story room, we tossed around, what might it be? Might it be a teacher? And we didn't want to impeach on the Shane and Joan story. Now, I'm not sure whether it had happened already or whether it was still in the planning, but from very early on with Joan, I had this story up my sleeve. She can't just be this bad screw who she's got to be three-dimensional. She can't just be one-dimensional, go in, put the gloves on, bash somebody up. She's got to have a heart, and we've got to see that. And so the Auntie Joan story was, whether it had been to air, or whether it had been filmed by then, or whether it was still in the planning stage, it was on the drawing board, and had been on the drawing board from day one, as far as I was concerned. We went through a whole heap of other ideas for how we put Bobby into a family. And
Oh, make
anyone,
I love this.
anyone, any one of those which had a woman in it would have undercut the Jones story.
Yeah.
So even though the Jones story and the Stan and Bobby story were not concurrent, we said, well, then it has to be someone she meets at the prison. It has to be a social worker or something. And I said, what if it's not? What if it's someone who is just, basically there like a handyman, or someone who comes and does regular deliveries? And once we said handyman,
Ah,
we said, okay, we're going to try and cast it again. And we'd had some kind of that similar type of character, but not person, in Alan Hopgood. We'd had a
yeah,
character.
yeah.
Yeah,
Love it.
we'd had that. And so I thought, if this is cast wrong, it's going to be an absolute disaster. And I remember saying, I wonder if Brian James would come back. And them saying, well, he can't even come back, he's a screw. And I said, but I wonder if he can only do part-time work because of the heart attack. And so he's a handyman. He's been all his life around prisons. He can't give them up. And because he's already been in the prison, he knows the prison. He knows the people. He knows the prisoners. And it would be an easy thing for him to become involved with anyone that we want. But let's see if it would work with Bobby. Maybe he's the key to Bobby getting out and having a family.
Yeah.
And so you say you didn't believe it. Do
Now,
you believe it now?
now I do, but I didn't see that. So that's why it's important we do these every week, because now
Well, I think
yeah,
I
I see
think
it now.
I think the advantage of these over, and I'm not saying one is better than the other, both are entirely valid. But I think the advantage to these soapboxes over your talking prisoner interviews is that mostly the actresses can only talk about their characters. They can't talk about what was planned and didn't pan out because they don't know. They can't talk about how their character was created because they don't know. They talk about what they know, which is the character that they played, by learning the lines off a script and putting that into action. So it's limited. I mean, it's exciting for the fans, but it's limited in how much actual information about the show. And if they're fans of the show, rather than fans of any particular actress, then they're going to find out more on these podcasts than they are on the Talking Prisoner ones. But it's fascinating to hear some of those actresses' view on their own roles rather than my view on the character when I was creating it,
Correct.
because they're a million miles apart, and in a lot of the cases of characters that started from the beginning, when I wasn't there, and so I didn't create. In a lot of those cases, the actresses had every right to say, "Well, there was virtually nothing for me to work with. I had to create this character." Whereas in the later scenes, and I found on my computer on an old drive, I found some actual audition scenes written for various shows. I wouldn't have one for Prisoner because we didn't have computers in those days. But it is interesting, and I think I've said before, I wrote actual audition scenes
Did you
for
ever
the
keep any of
characters.
your stuff from? It's one thing I've wanted to ask you for a long time, and it just jogged my memory. But did you ever keep any stuff like written notes, scripts, like a Bible? Like,
I kept a copy of every one of my prisoner scripts, right? And when I was extremely broke, round about 2011, I sold them for about, I think the top one went for about $50. My originals, my copies. Um, I desperately needed money. I had no money even for food. I hadn't then, even though I was old enough for the pension, I hadn't applied for it. Pride got in the way. And I thought, I'm not going to live off the state. Not when I was earning hundreds and thousands of dollars, which would translate to millions of dollars now. I spent it. I did something with it. You can have money for money's sake, or you can have money to do things with. And I had money to do things with. I bought my youngest daughter a unit. I put a
yeah,
new kitchen in the first home of my oldest daughter. I gave money to friends who needed new cars, whatever, and I still had enough left over to live like a queen for a few
yeah.
years, which was great. But
Well,
I didn't save any of it. So I sold all my original scripts. I only have still on, and if we had been on computer, it would have been simple. I could just
print it.
print out any number of extras.
Yeah.
And if in fact I had kept copies of anything, I could have printed copies of straight taken a copy to a printer and said, print me 20 copies of this script. And in fact, we have talked about this,
Oh yeah,
Matt.
I
I
still need to do that.
I do have
Blue
my
Heelers.
script of, and this is for any Blue Healers fans watching, I do have the script called One More Day, in which I wrote, in which Maggie Doyle dies. And Matt and I have talked about, and we will talk about more in August at the event. Matt and I have talked about doing maybe a limited edition bound copy of that script. And probably we will take advance orders so we know how many. But that is virtually, I have got a whole heap of home and away scripts on computer, which I can print out anytime I want.
The reason
So if
we will do
anyone,
that. We'll,
pardon?
we'll do these ideas 100%.
We will do things
Yeah.
like this and make them available. I'll
Yeah.
sign them individually, not just Coral Drouyn, but I'll sign them individually to each fan. But that's the only one of my shows, and I think some of my kids' shows like Street Smarts and Wildcat, that I've actually got copies on computer
Because
still.
reason I ask, I've got a memorabilia business, and 2 weeks ago, something come into my hands, which I'll show the fans and yourself at a later stage. But they are three original director's kits from Neighbours when it was on Channel 7. And
Wow.
they are fascinating. Like they've got all the character profiles with the photos, all the layouts of the houses, the plans. It's
Brilliant.
it's
Absolutely
unbelievable.
brilliant.
And I just
Absolutely
love that
brilliant.
stuff. It's like to
Yeah. Yeah, well, we for fans of later shows, I've got a fair amount. I've got to find it on the computer, but I'm going through. Like I put things that are past things. I put them on separate drives so that they're not
no way.
cluttering up my computer because I have 29,000 files on this new computer and I've only had it a month.
Oh, have we got a chance to put another one in before we?
Oh God, yes, we've got a chance for a couple more because I
Oh,
do want
awesome.
to talk. I talked to Jerry Maguire. That sounds like the movie, doesn't it? I've
Jerry
never
Maguire.
actually thought of that before. But I talked I talked to Fletch last week, and because someone had asked about Jim Fletcher. Have you got the question there?
There's a few on Jim, and I know it wasn't your character, but yeah, there is a few. Which one are you?
It
Where are,
doesn't matter. There was some confusion about, why was Jim replaced? I think one of them asked, was Rick Manning a replacement for
oh, here it
Jim?
is.
Well,
My queer Kevin McConaughey. My query regarding Jim. Don't think Coral had anything to do with the character's creation, but she may have joined as he left. Interested to know if she had any thoughts on the character. He got a bit stale, and Jared Maguire said he could basically tell what Jim's lines were going to be, which he actually did discuss with us
yeah,
on here. Does she think the character could have stayed, and how would she have stopped him from becoming so stale?
okay. Um, that's an interesting question, but let me say, off the bat, that Jerry's told, I sent Jerry an email and said, can we talk about why you actually left? Because people are asking, were you fired? Did you leave of your own accord? Did your contract run out or what? And this is what Jerry told me. Jerry said he was a thorn in the
Was that John McCrae?
suits. Pardon?
Didn't I think he said something about John McCrae? He mentioned.
John McCrae. John McCrae, whose name he couldn't remember when we talked the other day. Incidentally, if anyone um, has access to his Facebook page, you will know that Jerry lost the love of his life a couple of years ago to cancer, and Jerry is himself now undergoing treatment for cancer. And he's doing well, but he is seeing every day as a blessing at the moment. So anyone who is in touch, if you are Matt, if you're on his friends list or whatever, just little notes, he appreciates them. He really does appreciate them. He and Val were big thorns in the suits sides. And he and Val did fight for residuals and for play salaries. He was only contracted to do, I may have mentioned this but last week or the week before, that although it was 2 hours to air, it was classed as 4 episodes a week, 4 half-hour episodes, in case at any time they ever wanted to split it into like a soap, like Home and Away, and run it 4 nights a week, which meant that the third commercial break in every episode had to potentially be a cliffhanger, which is quite hard to do when you're trying to write a 1 hour seamless story. You've got to build it at that third commercial break to a point where if they decide to split the episode in half, it will stand as a cliffhanger. Now, Jerry did not get on with John McCrae, who we call Mr. Hollywood, right?
He's still alive, John
Because,
McCrae.
is he still alive?
Yeah.
No, he died some years ago. I've got to say, I loved him. I
Okay.
loved him, but he was a bit of a twit.
Okay.
He was indeed. I will give you an example. I went to him and told him a story where I had someone put into the prison who was actually an undercover cop. Now, I can't remember whether it was the Ruth Ballinger era or probably was earlier than that because we had Mari Trevor the last couple of years. So John McCrae was the producer. I said, I want to do this story. We put in an undercover cop and someone discovers that they are an undercover cop. They're in there to get information from one of the prisoners and their life is put at risk. But we see them for the first few weeks and we believe they're just another prisoner.
Yeah.
John McCrae's question to me was, isn't that going to be hard to shoot? And I said, why? And he said, well, if she's undercover, that means we can't shoot her on location. And I said, John, undercover doesn't mean that you can only shoot them in the studio. It means they're pretending to be a prisoner. And he said, well, how would that work? I had to actually explain what an undercover cop was to the producer of the show, who had not got the faintest idea. So Jerry Maguire is arguing that because he's been there, one of the longest, one of the original cast,
And
he
one of the
deserves,
first ever male officers on the show, too.
yeah, he deserves 4 episodes a week, which is what Val had got. 4 episodes a week, which because they were paid per episode, if you were getting, let's say, $500 an episode, and that's roughly what the stars were getting in the early stages. If you're only in 2 episodes a week, you're earning $1,000 a week. But if you negotiated to be in 4 episodes a week, your salary instantly doubled and you were on $2,000 a week. Jerry wanted to be on 4 episodes a week. Plus, he was causing problems and this is from his own admission. He said, I cause problems, and you know what they're like. They want it as easy as possible. They'll settle for less quality as long as it's easy for them. And he did very sweetly say to me, I would have loved to have stayed and worked with your scripts because I know that you wouldn't have made it easy for me. He said, but I was getting a spit and a cough. And I might add the same thing happened with Tom Coyne's character on Blue Heelers with John Woods. I was told, don't give John too much to do as Tom Coyne because he doesn't like to work too hard. And on the other side, with me not knowing, John Woods was going to them saying, can't I have a decent freaking story for a change? Can't I have something to do other than open the door and say, oh, you in here? And so they were lying to me to get me to write him down because they wanted to push some of the other
Was
younger
was John
characters.
Wood ever? I have seen on credits on Prisoner writer John Wood. Was he ever a writer on Prisoner?
He was indeed. He wrote 2 or 3 scripts for us.
Right.
And yes, that was him.
That's him. Right. Okay.
And
Because I love John
look,
Wood. I always go back to Rafferty's Rules was one of my all-time.
oh,
He
fantastic
was
show,
amazing.
fabulous show.
Yeah.
So Jerry was making life hard for them. And he knowingly concedes that. And when it came up to time to talk about his new contract, he went in to negotiate 4 episodes a week. And to his astonishment, John McCrae virtually said, these aren't his words, but John McCrae virtually said, well, we don't need you anymore. We're writing the character out.
Jeez.
So as he said, you want to say I was sacked? Yes, I was sacked. You want to say my contract was up? Yes, my contract was up. You want to say I left of my own accord? Yes, I left of my own accord. All 3 of them are true. because he would not have re-signed unless they gave him 4 episodes. His contract was coming to a close, and John McCrae had already decided that Jim Fletcher was going. Now, John McCrae then came to me and said, "You're going to have to write Jim Fletcher out," because apparently I wrote him out. I don't even remember writing him out, but apparently I did. He said, because even though we speak now quite a bit, he was so supportive when my husband died, because he had lost his wife. And even though we're good mates now, we didn't work a lot together. I think probably you'll find we overlapped only by a matter of months, if that. But John McCrae came to me and said, "Gerard Maguire won't sign his contract," which, yeah, it's sort of true,
Yeah.
but
Reason behind it.
it's not the whole truth.
Yeah.
It's only partly the truth. So it was all three. Jerry says now, I was sacked, and written out. My contract came to an end, and I was leaving. All three are true. I said to him, "You must be the only actor in captivity that's ever gone out on all three bases." So I did ask him, for the people who asked specifically. Yes, there was more that could be done with him, and absolutely he deserved better stories than he got at the end. And you have to remember that, and I'm not knocking the early writers, because I know that many of the fans far prefer series 1 and 2 to anything that followed. And I did not come onto this show. I came on as a writer at episode 145. It had been going 18 months. And I think I came on creating stories before I came in-house in the late 100s, and they paid me for the stories. And I think it was the early 200s when I actually took over the team and came in-house, and was there for and it may even have been the late 200s, I don't know, but I was providing story before that. But Dave Worthington was in charge of the storyline team, and very much those stories went past Denise Morgan and Ian Bradley, because they had created the show. But as I think I've said earlier on, they never expected this show to last as it did. And so there was not the work put into creating those characters and looking at where they possibly might go in the long term, because there was no long term. Not because Denise Morgan or Ian Bradley were bad at their jobs. Both of them absolutely spot on experts at their jobs. But they thought they were creating a 16-week show.
Yeah.
They did not know they were creating something which would run for 600 and what, 92 episodes, is it?
Yeah.
Or 682, something like that. They
Yeah.
had no idea that's what was happening. Were there more possibilities for Fletch? Yes, there were. And I would have loved to have kept him on, because he is a bloody good actor. Now, we have not touched on Len Murphy, the three men in solitary, and we've already done what, an hour and a half, Matt?
We've got more than an hour and 45.
Okay, and
Well,
the voice is going.
I know.
So, can we hold this over
Yeah, you can
until
continue
next
on.
week,
Yeah,
and continue this subject? Because I would like to talk about the David Bridges character. A lot of people have said to me, "Oh, well, David Bridges is just another version of Bev Baker." Sorry, you are totally 100% wrong, completely wrong. So I would like to talk about that character. I would like to talk about Len Murphy and what the future may have been for Len Murphy, and for Maury Fields. And I would like to talk about the three men in solitary, because there are still people who say it was the most stupid storyline ever. And yet it actually happened. Sometimes truth is stranger than
And
fiction. It
yeah,
happened. Admittedly, it happened in America. And for God's sake, the Americans are capable of doing anything, God bless them. Um, it's a country which is a country of extremes, which we maybe don't have here. But nevertheless, it is a true story. There are characters based on real characters that I read about and thought I can adapt that for here.
yeah.
And I had mentioned in a storyline meeting, would you believe in America they put men in the women's prison? And in fact, now, I don't know if you're aware of this, they have mixed prisons. They
Ah,
have mixed male female prisons. They have separate wings, but the
yeah,
rec room is shared by the male and female prisoners. The dining room is shared by the male and female prisoners, and they only need one set of admin kind of in the center
yeah. All
to
right.
deal with
Yeah,
both
no,
wings.
we'll do
So
it
can
next
we
week.
continue doing talking
100%.
about the men and behind the scenes stuff next week?
Definitely. I would love to. And before you go, are you watching the great debate this Thursday?
Oh God, yes. It's Friday morning our time live.
Oh, Friday. Yes, Friday. Yes.
It's
Yes.
Friday morning, it's 10 o'clock Hong Kong, which should mean it's midday live here on Friday morning. And I'm actually going to the North Coast up near Noosa for the weekend. But I've told my friends that I can't get the train until Friday afternoon because I've got to watch the debate on Friday morning. And those of you that have access to CNN, you may think, oh, well, what does this mean for me? It's got nothing to do with me. It's got repercussions for the entire world who becomes the next president of the United States. Believe me, it's a bit like those people who now regret voting for Brexit because they didn't think it through just at the time. They thought, oh, yeah, bugger it, we can go it alone. And it's the reason why there's such a mess in Britain now. So it is important to all of us all over the world who becomes the next president of the United States, even if we don't want an old man who has to hobble around. Better that than a nightmare on legs, an orange nightmare on legs.
Sounds like a character you created.
Actually, I could not create a character as extreme as Donald Trump. And I noticed that one of our English fans, who is a Donald Trump fan, actually made a post on the
On
page, Matt, which was a veiled threat
that we
to
should
me.
about politics or
Just about Trump, lay off Trump. Don't make veiled threats at me, sunshine, because I really do live in a country where there is free speech. In Australia, there really is free speech. And I will say anything I want about Donald Trump. It is my opinion. That's all. It's my opinion.
I
It's
just heard
not
Nolan McKenzie
necessarily.
going through my head. Then when you said, "Don't make threats at me, sunshine," yeah,
Sounds like a line I would have written, doesn't it?
yeah,
Oh dear. I remember I used to have a line in my character, in my cabaret act, where I said something about Queensland not having saving. And at the time, I said they don't have daylight saving in Queensland because everybody knows the sun shines out of Joe Bielke-Peterson's ass and he's not getting up an hour early for anyone. And and it used to get a really good laugh, not least of all in Queensland. So I
yeah.
remember giving Judy Bryant a line at one stage where she says, "Oh, they think the sun shines out of his ass," or she says "ass" because Judy was American, of course. And a critic, a television critic, actually said what a great script it was, and quoted this line and said, kudos to the writer for adding some real humor to this show. And yeah, I mean, we have freedom of expression here far more than they do. And it's not government governed. I mean, in America, the government says you have freedom of speech, but if you're a Trump supporter, you and you want to, you can threaten to kill someone who has said something to somebody who is not a Trump supporter, and nothing happens.
Yeah.
You can have to be, picked up and put into protective custody to save you from Trump supporters. And people say, oh, but that's not Trump. Sorry. Yes, it is.
Oh, there we go. All right. That was episode 9 of Coral Soapbox. Please like and subscribe.
Thanks, guys. I'll go and gargle now and get my voice back for next week.
All right. Get better.
Bye, guys.
See you next week.
Bye, love.
I used to give her roses. I wish I could again, but that was on the outside, and things were different then. We'd build our world together, sharing all the love we'd known, till I had to face the nightmare of waking up alone. On the inside the sun still shines, and the rain falls down, but the sun and rain are prisoners too when morning comes around. Last night I dreamed we were together, sharing all the love we'd known, till I had to face the nightmare of waking up alone. On the inside the sun still shines, and the rain falls down, but the sun and rain are prisoners too when morning comes around. On the inside the roses grow, they don't mind the stony ground, but the roses here are prisoners too when morning comes around. I used to give her roses, I wish I could again, but that was on the outside, and things were different